Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, I'm Sean, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. Here's a question. Which marketing book has sold over 8 million copies and you might never have read it? When we're looking for marketing advice, we're easily awed by the big names. The bestsellers of the day seem to capture our attention, and in the process, we fail to implement age-old wisdom, which is approximately what I was doing too, as I went back and forth between my home and my office. Right next to the door, there was a book, and it was staring back at me every single day. I was ignoring it. And this book is reputed to have sold millions of copies and was written almost 100 years ago. The name of the book, Scientific Advertising by Claude Hopkins. Hopkins wrote these two books, My Life in Advertising and Scientific Advertising. And he believed that advertising existed only to sell something, and it should be measured and it should be justified. And he did something that had never been done before. Hopkins gave away all of his secrets. His advertising was working amazingly well. Instead of squirreling away his ideas, he published them. The book Scientific Advertising and later My Life in Advertising are two books that are as relevant today as they've ever been. I have a print copy right in front of me, and it fills up about 100 pages, and it's pretty large print. And as you read it, you're likely to be reminded about how English was spoken 100 years ago. And some people, they get put off by that English. But if you sidestep the weird construction of the English from yesteryear, you're going to find some gems. And here are 3 of my favorite slices from those pages. The topics sound obvious, and they are, but we can miss the point. So let's take each of those topics one by one. The first one being sampling. The second one, tell your full story. And the third is being specific. Let's start out with the first one, which is about sampling. And I'm going to read directly from the book, just a paragraph. We do not advocate samples given out promiscuously. Samples distributed to homes, like waifs on the doorstep, probably never pay. Many of them never reach the housewife. When they do, there is no predilection for them. The product is cheapened. It is not introduced in a favorable way. Many advertisers do not understand this. Give samples to interested people only. Give them only to people who exhibit that interest by some effort. Give them only to people whom you have told your story. First, create an atmosphere of respect, a desire and expectation. When people are in that mood, your sample will usually confirm the qualities that you claim. That was Hopkins. And when we get back, we realize that one of the biggest reasons why someone doesn't buy something is because of the factor of risk. Let's say you go to the food store today and you're in the mood for some fruit. You spot the watermelon, and immediately you're not sure. Right there, right next to that watermelon, is someone, and that person hands you a slice. You taste it, and it's delicious. A few seconds earlier, you weren't sure if the melon was any good, and yet there you are with a watermelon in your hand, headed towards the checkout. And it does occur to you that the sample you ate could be from any other watermelon. There's no guarantee that yours will be just as yummy. Even so, that little sample, it changed your behavior, almost like a Jedi mind trick. Sampling takes on different forms. Surely you remember sitting through what was one of the coolest inventions of the movies, namely the trailers. As a kid, I'd drag my father to the movies as early as possible just so that I could see all the trailers. And if we go in today's world and we go to Amazon.com, we can look into a book and look through the pages, do quite a bit of reading just to make up our minds. Or we can listen to part of the audio so that we can gauge whether we want to buy it. If you look at our site at psychotactics.com, you'll notice there are screenshots from the pages of the book. There are screenshots from the courses. And as a cartoonist, I'm fascinated with words as well as visuals, which is why a book like The Brain Audit will have approximately 99 cartoons within the page of the book. Now, clients don't know all of this merely by looking at the cover and the sales page, so they need to look inside the book. They need to read a bit. They need to experience the feeling of going through the course. And a sample, one that they can click and zoom, well, that forms a significant reduction of risk. Without needing to buy anything or even go through the rigmarole of asking for a refund if they don't like the product, they can sample it. Yet sampling doesn't stop at just looking inside. At Psychotactics, we tend to see entire courses as samples. Let's take on a big, chunky course like article writing. A client might be intimidated at the thought of having to spend 3 months with this one big course on article writing. What if the instruction isn't to their liking? What if they end up spending all of that time, all of their money, and it comes to naught? Once again, you can use smaller products to reduce the risk. A client might buy a product like outlining, and this costs around $39. Having liked and found value in that product, the client will go on to buying something else, like maybe the headline writing course. All of these booklets and books and mini courses and webinars, they're like a dinner sequence. And this helps that client to gauge her appetite for that big main meal, which is the article writing course. To jump in with both feet to a big and expensive and 3-month-long course, that's not the type of action that we are prone to take. Instead, we snip off tiny little bites at a time. Hopkins talks about sampling, and while his level of sampling was mostly restricted to physical products that you buy in a store, sampling works just as well with digital products. It works really well with courses. It works with consulting. A webinar series could be a sample for consulting. It could be a sample for training. Equally so, it could help a client reduce their risk factor, and as a result, they end up buying an entire online product course. However, in this rush for giving away samples, it's easy to miss out on one very critical point, namely that of opt-in. Even 100 years ago, Hopkins talked about the samples as being homeless waifs. And this brings us to a tantalizing point, namely opt-in. Well, there are samples that you, me, any one of us can access. Yet there also need to be samples that are fiercely shielded behind an opt-in system. In the days of Hopkins, it meant racing to the drawer, getting a set of scissors, cutting out a coupon, finding an envelope, licking a stamp, and then mailing it to get that offer. As you can tell, all of the opting in meant that the person had a high level of interest. Today, because of the internet, we think it's okay to make things easier for the client. Yes and no. Some things should be more accessible, some not so. Here's an example or two, both online and offline. Let's start off with the online. Recently, we made some big changes to the membership site at 5000 BC. The entire forum is brand new. It's a treat to work with. However, there are well over 350,000 posts. Yes, it's a busy place. That meant that it could take a few days to move all that information across and to make sure that it all worked just like we wanted it to. As a result, we announced that we were going to have back-to-back seminars, 3 back-to-back seminars, and we didn't take Hopkins' advice. We didn't have an opt-in. Normally, 50 to 100 clients show up for a webinar. And how many turned up for this one? Without opt-in, it was a total of 5 people. 5 on Monday, 5 on Tuesday, and ditto on Wednesday. And when we look at offline events or offline situations, you have something similar. We used to have meetups, and the early meetups were a real waste of time for us. We'd announce that we were in a city and clients would promise to show up, and then they'd back away at the last minute. So we changed our strategy. We didn't just get clients to opt in, but we also started to charge $50. As a result, we don't have that problem anymore. Barring a last-minute dropout, everyone else turns up and we have almost perfect attendance. And then everyone has a good time, which is precisely what you want in the first place. It might occur to you that meetups and webinars might be an excellent example of opt-in, but how are they connected with samples? Good question, and here's what we found out. When clients meet with us, either through the virtual space of webinars or meetups, the trust factor goes up. It's a tiny event, yet it gets client to know us better. And as a result, they show up in more paid events like workshops or courses. And this is because we're looking at those meetups as samples, we're looking at those webinars as samples, we're looking at not just tiny little bits of, hey, here's the front 5 pages of the book, or here's a little snippet. But you can actually look at whole products, tinier products or tinier situations as samples, which is why we've got to set it up. We've got to have those tinier situations, maybe an hour here or an hour there, either offline or online. And that gives the client a chance to reduce their risk. It becomes a sample, and that enables them to go to the next stage. When you look at samples, it's tricky to know which is a sample and which is the final product. A one-day workshop might just be a sample of a 3-day event. A free webinar becomes the sample for a series of paid webinars. And it's not like the progression necessarily goes from webinar to webinar to webinar or that way. Sometimes a person might get a booklet and then go to a course or listen to a podcast and then sign up for a consulting program. All of them, however, are samples. They all needn't be free. They all needn't be easy to access. And think about that for a while. Could you run with a series of samples that leads to other purchases? If that's what you plan to do, you're going to be busy and you're likely to need a sales page. At which point, the second of Hopkins' principles comes into play, which is to tell your full story. Let's find out a bit more about it, shall we? Which YouTube video gets watched more? The 4-minute video or the 14-minute one? It was a trick question, because length doesn't matter. What mattered back in 1920 and what matters today is not the length or how many words or how long it is, but how you manage to keep that person's interest, which is precisely the point that Hopkins makes in his chapter, Tell the Full Story. 4 lines in scientific advertising sum up the importance of getting the idea across. And this is what Hopkins writes. You're like a salesman in a busy man's office. He, the salesman, may have tried time and again to get entry. He may never be admitted again. This is his one chance to get action, and he must employ it to the full. And this is a lesson that even YouTube had to learn, because at one point, you couldn't upload YouTube videos if they extended past 14 minutes. Today, according to Wired magazine, makeup tutorials are rarely less than 12 minutes. The storytime category is well into 45 minutes. And even popular video creators like Jenna Marbles, who started out posting videos of 2.5 minutes, have now moved to well over 16.5 minutes. And yes, 10 million people will watch her videos. So if you're wondering if all of this full story bit only appeals to video, no, it doesn't. Newspapers like The Guardian have an extremely popular category called long reads. Long reads, is that popular in today's day and age when no one reads? Of course it is. So does the BBC. They have long reads. GQ magazine, same name, long reads. The Independent, The Economist, Wired magazine. They all have these very long pieces that people want to read because they're interesting. But the crux of what Hopkins is talking about isn't necessarily editorial content. Instead, he's talking about a sales page, which is what most, if not all of us, need when we're selling products, when we're selling services. And it's dead easy for us to believe that no one reads anymore. That line has been proven to be untrue. People do read. People read what interests them, and they will read it in great detail. If anything, leaving out parts of the full story is somewhat like landing in an airport and finding one of your bags missing. When a client reads your sales page, they're dealing solely with one factor, and that is risk. They don't know if you're going to be solving their problem. They don't know if you've got the right solution. So when they enter that sales page, they're looking, hey, is my problem being solved? Am I the right person to buy this? Are my objections being considered? And then they need social proof like testimonials and reviews. And finally, it comes down to risk reversal and uniqueness. Now try running a sales page without this, and what you have is an incomplete story. It works online, it also works offline. When I first started out in marketing, I was consulting with a sofa store. Let's say you're a customer, you walk into the sofa store, what are you going to do next? Most people, they do something similar. They look at the sofas, they ask questions about the dimensions, they sit on the sofa to try it out. A sequence like that is nice, but it doesn't ensure the sale of a $4,000 sofa set. We had to tell the full story, which is precisely where we took Hopkins' message to heart. I asked the owner of the store to tell me about every part of the sofa. He started with the foam, then he went to the frame, and he went into enormous detail about the frame. Is it sturdy enough? Will it last after 5 years? Will it warp? Is it made of softwood? Is it made of hardwood? Does the frame contain particle board? Does it have plastic? Does it have metal? And when a client walked into the room, they weren't expecting the full story. Instead, the full story is what they experienced. We'd have little leaflets going into almost obsessive detail about the frame, about the construction of the legs, about the upholstery, and most importantly, the foam. Somehow, the foam seems to hold the imagination of the customer. They'd hang around for quite a while, they'd raise their eyebrows at the considerably higher prices, and then they'd walk out. They'd walk out and check the sofas at the competitor's store. And a few days later, they'd be back. The salesman at the other store knew nothing about the sofas, they'd say to us. They didn't know about the composition of the frame. They couldn't tell us much about the legs or the springs. They were confused when we mentioned 8-way handsprings, and they weren't able to explain whether there was webbing or there was mesh involved. And when it got to the foam, it was a complete mystery to those other salesmen too, because they couldn't answer all the questions. What was happening was that the clients weren't getting the full story at the other stores. And when they got the full story at our store, they felt that burden, that risk get off their shoulders. Sure, it was a more expensive sofa. It was almost twice the price of all the other sofas out there. But they felt this is a one-time or at least a long-term commitment, and it was a good idea to go with a store that knew what they were talking about, that was able to comprehend what they needed and the risk that they felt, and then give them the full story so they felt good about their purchase. When you don't tell the full story, all you're doing is increasing that level of risk, which isn't to say that the full story needs to be boring. In an article, you can have case studies or sofa stories, and all of that keeps the client's attention. On a sales page, you can have videos, you can have appropriate animation. And on the Psychotactic sales pages, we put in cartoons. And these cartoons sell serious products, like books on planning and pricing. So telling the full story still very much calls on you to tell an interesting story. A sentence or two will never do, says Hopkins. Brief advertising is never traced, he goes on to say. Every traced ad will tell a complete story. Never be guided in any way by ads that are untraced. Apply your own advertising sense, your own advertising common sense. Take the opinion of nobody, the verdict of nobody, who knows nothing about his returns. So that's Hopkins for you. And to get back to today's world, there are situations where the full story may temporarily be suspended. In the last 20 years, we've had 2 products that we've launched with no story at all. The first one was called Black Belt Presentations, and the second one was more recent and covered how to start up your business. Both products didn't have sales pages to begin with. All we did was send out a short email asking clients to trust us, and based on that trust, to go ahead and to buy the product. We added the sales page a bit later, which then told the full story. However, such a product may only get traction when clients trust you. And even then, you're likely to see a drop in sales, or rather, you don't see the sales at the levels of a new product, which are usually quite high compared with, existing products. So without doubt, the full story matters. You can put a picture may tell 1,000 words, but it's the full story that makes the sale. And at this point in time, I think we'll just wrap up this podcast and take it to a second part. We'll do a little summary. So what have we covered so far? The first thing that we talked about was sampling. Now, we've all run into sampling, but the crux of sampling is how you look at sampling. We might just see sampling as taking a little bite of the cake. But in many cases, if not all cases, the cake itself is a sample for, a gigantic cake. Which is to say that when you do that 1-hour workshop or 1-hour presentation, either online or offline, what you're doing is creating a sample, a paid sample to another bigger paid product or training or consulting, whatever it is that you're selling. And especially when you're dealing with information and advice, this plays a big role. When you're dealing with just products like, say, cheese or something like that, then yes, you have to give away that free sample. But again, even in that case, it doesn't have to be free. It can be a paid product. It can be something that they come back to buy more cheese or more of something. So you have to look at it from a different perspective, which is that you've got to put in all of these free samples and paid samples, and that leads to even bigger consulting, training, leverage, or products. The crux of sampling needs to be opt-in. And opt-in is so crucial because when people don't opt in and they're just given stuff, they just take it and they just walk away. Sampling still works when there's no opt-in. People still buy stuff, sales still go up. But the moment you have opt-in, it changes the dynamics, it changes the whole perspective of how people react to it, because now they have to go over this tiny little barrier, or maybe even a bigger barrier, and they have to opt in. And that makes your product, service, or training far more desirable. Well, that was the first part. And the second one was telling the full story. Editorial usually tells the full story, unless it's Twitter, in which case it's telling just whatever you want to hear. But usually you're getting the full story in editorial. What we fail to do is tell that full story on our sales pages, in our sales letters. And that's the crux. You have to be able to tell the full story through your emails when you're selling stuff. It's only when you tell that full story that people think, wait a second, this is interesting to me. The full story reduces the risk, and eventually it's all about risk. So telling that full story, like we were talking about the springs and the foam and all of that stuff when you're selling the product, the same thing applies to a membership site like 5000BC or any of the products that we're selling. We have to tell that full story. Otherwise, clients get confused, and then when they get confused, they just don't buy. So that brings us to the end of this podcast. We will continue this episode next time, and let's find out what's happening in Psychotactics land. It's April, and April is autumn in New Zealand. And if you go to the South Island, it's very cool because all of those leaves turn wonderful colors, especially if you're in Arrowtown. So if you haven't visited New Zealand, this is your official invitation. Come to New Zealand in the autumn. It's nice. It's really cool. Cool as in physically cool, and also very beautiful. But what's happening in Psychotactics land is what you probably want to know. On the 18th of April, we have the Uniqueness course. So that goes on sale on the 18th of April. You have to go to psychotactics.com/U goodies. That's U for, I don't know, U for uniqueness, I guess. U goodies. And that's on the 18th of April. And then on the 16th of May, we have the pre-sale course, but that's still a while away. If you want to just check out stuff, you want to check out some smaller products, go to psychotactics.com/tiny, TINY. And that'll give you a list of the smaller products where you can check out what you've bought or not bought, or even what you would like to try just as a first timer. And that's psychotactics.com/tiny. And finally, come to 5000BC. And 5000BC is a membership site. It's not very expensive, and we've deliberately kept it that way. Most membership sites, they charge like $250 a month. We charge about $279 a year at this point in time. And the reason for that is not because we can't charge more. It's because there is this vast amount of discussion that happens over there. And that discussion is very cool for the clients, because once you buy a product, once you buy a service, once you get stuck somewhere, there's nobody to help you. All of these places, Facebook groups after Twitter groups, after whatever groups that you have out there, you don't hear the sound of that you just heard. That's one of the groups asking a question and getting an answer, and then we have this discussion. So join us at 5000bc.com and find out for yourself. And with that, we come to the end of this podcast. Next time, we'll finish off scientific advertising, the third part. I'll say bye for now. Bye-bye.